Starting today, Canadian softwood lumber sent to the U.S. will face an additional 10% duty.
And there's Canada's lumber industry having to deal with the pain of tariff on tariff, a 10% hike on an existing 35% tariff.
The price of a 2x4 rarely makes national headlines, yet over the past year, that humble piece of wood has turned into one of the most powerful pressure points in North American economics. Canadian lumber, once treated as a steady and predictable supply line for American builders, is now at the center of a policy clash that is reshaping housing markets on both sides of the border. Prices in the United States have surged to levels few expected. Canadian mills are rewriting their business models, and a supply chain that operated almost automatically for decades has been pulled apart. The ripple effects are spreading through construction sites, mortgage approvals, and government budgets, and the long-term consequences are only beginning to take shape. The chain reaction began when President Donald Trump imposed tariffs on Canadian softwood lumber, with rates ranging from 35% to as high as 47.65%, depending on the producer. Canfor faced duties of 47.65%, while West Fraser was hit with 26.47%, and other companies landed somewhere in between. These were not minor adjustments meant to signal displeasure. They were steep enough to make Canadian lumber far more expensive in U.S. markets overnight, and the goal was clear: force Canadian producers to accept Washington's terms and give American mills breathing room to capture a larger share of domestic demand. Instead of backing down, Prime Minister Mark Carney unveiled a sweeping $5 billion strategic response designed to reduce Canada's reliance on the United States altogether. The plan was not limited to temporary relief checks or diplomatic protests. It centered on a structural overhaul of the industry. At its core stood a mandatory Buy Canada procurement policy requiring federal agencies and crown corporations to prioritize Canadian suppliers for government projects, with lumber explicitly included. This was not framed as a preference or suggestion. It became a binding requirement that Canadian government construction must source Canadian wood, even if foreign alternatives were available at lower prices. The scale of that guaranteed demand is enormous. Federal infrastructure projects, public housing programs, military installations, and government buildings represent billions of dollars in annual construction spending. By locking this demand to domestic mills, Ottawa effectively created a protected home market at stable prices during a period of international trade turbulence. The government did not stop there. The Business Development Bank of Canada began offering loans ranging from $2 million to $5 million to small and medium-sized lumber firms hit by U.S. tariffs, with favorable interest rates and extended maturities. Larger enterprises gained access to expanded tariff loan facilities with improved terms, giving them room to adjust without collapsing under sudden revenue losses. Regional support followed. Funding for tariff response initiatives jumped from $450 million to $1 billion over 3 years. Ontario allocated $20 million for forest access roads and another $10 million to support sawmill chip programs. British Columbia launched a $2.5 million manufacturing jobs fund aimed at modernizing operations and preserving employment. The Prairie provinces rolled out their own regional response packages. In effect, every major lumber-producing region received coordinated federal and provincial backing at the same time. The immediate damage was real. 22 mills closed permanently, and roughly 5,600 workers lost their jobs. Around 50 operations faced temporary curtailments, yet the closures were not random. Companies such as West Fraser, Canfor, and Interfor used the crisis to shut down higher-cost facilities and concentrate production in more efficient, modern plants. Government loans helped bridge the gap during restructuring, and the Buy Canada mandate guaranteed a domestic buyer ready to absorb output. The financial mechanics of this shift are straightforward. Loans from the Business Development Bank must be repaid. Investments in modernization require returns. As mills restructure, they recover costs through higher prices in the domestic market. Because federal procurement rules mandate Canadian lumber, government projects become a captive source of demand, capable of sustaining elevated price levels. Analysts tracking the sector note that once restructuring expenses are embedded in production costs, prices rarely revert to earlier baselines. Even if tariffs were removed tomorrow, Canadian mills would have little incentive to chase American buyers when they can sell domestically at profitable rates with policy support behind them. Currency movements have not offset the tariff shock. The Canadian dollar weakened to around 1.45 against the US dollar, which under normal conditions would make exports more competitive. However, a 45% tariff overwhelms any exchange rate advantage. Selling into the United States under those conditions remains unattractive compared with domestic contracts or alternative export markets without punitive duties. This pivot is reshaping trade flows. British Columbia, historically a major supplier to Washington, Oregon, and California, has begun redirecting roughly 10% of its exports toward new destinations. Initial shipments to the United Kingdom are moving forward, tapping into a market that imports around 2.5 billion board feet annually. The UK has traditionally sourced from Sweden, Latvia, Ireland, and Finland, yet European timber supplies face their own constraints, and the loss of Russian wood following export bans has opened space for alternative suppliers. Canadian producers are positioning themselves as supplemental partners in a market seeking diversification. Asian markets are also in focus. Japan and South Korea have distinct grading and dimension requirements, but Canadian mills are investing in equipment to meet those specifications. British Columbia's existing shipping infrastructure, including facilities built around liquefied natural gas exports, provides logistical pathways into the Pacific. Even if margins in these markets are lower than pre-tariff U.S. sales, the absence of a 35 to 47% duty can produce comparable or better net returns. Once buyer relationships are established and supply chains recalibrated, reversing them becomes unlikely. While Canada reorganizes, the United States faces a tightening supply environment. American annual lumber consumption sits near 70 billion board feet across residential, commercial, and industrial uses. Domestic production runs around 58 billion board feet. The gap, roughly 12 billion board feet, has historically been filled largely by Canadian imports. Claims from the U.S. Lumber Coalition that American mills can fully meet demand do not align with capacity figures. Even with recent investments, the math leaves a shortfall. The housing sector feels the impact first. The United States is short about 4.5 million homes, according to Zillow, a figure that has climbed from 4.3 million in a short period. The National Association of Home Builders has echoed concerns about structural shortages. Annual housing starts last year reached about 1.36 million units, with forecasts now pointing toward 1.2 to 1.3 million. Closing a 4.5 million unit deficit while keeping up with population growth would require building roughly 2 million homes annually for a decade. Instead, construction activity is trending downward. Lumber plays a meaningful role in overall building costs, accounting for roughly 15 to 25% of the expense of constructing and finishing a typical American home. When framing lumber composite prices climb to $872 per thousand board feet, and analysts project sustained levels in the mid-50s to low 600s through the coming year, rather than returning to the $450 to $500 range, those increases feed directly into final home prices. The National Association of Home Builders estimated that new tariffs on Canadian lumber would add around $6,000 to the cost of a typical new home, a figure based on assumptions of temporary disruption and resumed Canadian supply. With supply permanently redirected and tariffs remaining in place, that estimate appears conservative. Mortgage rates dipping towards 6% provide some relief on financing, yet lower rates cannot compensate for construction costs that push entry-level homes beyond what buyers qualify for. A property priced at $200,000 becomes $220,000 or $240,000 as material costs rise, excluding families who were already stretching budgets. Demand softens, not because households lack interest, but because affordability limits are reached. Housing starts decline even as the shortage persists. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has floated the idea of declaring a national housing emergency, acknowledging that the current trajectory is unsustainable. Building millions of additional homes at accessible price points requires stable, reasonably priced inputs, When one of the most critical materials remains structurally elevated, the challenge intensifies. The long-term implications extend beyond quarterly earnings reports. As Canadian companies consolidate around efficient facilities supported by domestic policy and global buyers, they emerge less exposed to U.S. political cycles. American mills enjoy higher margins on existing output because reduced Canadian competition tightens supply, yet they cannot expand fast enough to replace the 12 billion board feet previously imported. Higher per-unit profits do not offset the broader contraction in housing construction that limits total volume. The social consequences in the United States are visible in rental markets and demographic trends. As homeownership drifts further out of reach for many young families, rental demand intensifies and multi-generational households become more common. Household formation slows. The shortage that stands at 4.5 million homes risks climbing toward 5 million and beyond if construction remains constrained. Each year of underbuilding compounds the deficit. Canada absorbed immediate pain in mill closures and job losses, yet the policy direction signals a permanent shift. Buy Canada procurement rules do not carry automatic expiration dates. Infrastructure upgrades financed through the $5 billion strategy are not easily reversed. Trade relationships with European and Asian partners, once established, tend to endure. Lumber from British Columbia moving toward London or Tokyo is unlikely to revert to Seattle in the absence of a compelling economic reason. President Trump aimed to shield American lumber producers from foreign competition. In practice, the tariffs accelerated a Canadian restructuring that reduced dependence on the U.S. market and redirected supply elsewhere. American builders now navigate higher input costs without a clear path to restoring the previous trade balance. The arithmetic remains unforgiving. Domestic output, near 58 billion board feet, cannot cover consumption around 70 billion, and the missing volume no longer flows freely from across the border. With each passing month, the contrast between Ottawa and Washington becomes more defined and harder to ignore. Canada is steadily shaping a lumber industry that serves its own construction needs first, while expanding relationships across Europe and Asia, building trade lanes that are not vulnerable to sudden political shocks. The United States, meanwhile, remains stuck with a housing deficit that cannot be solved without large volumes of reasonably priced materials. And those materials no longer move across the northern border the way they once did. Decisions made in the heat of a trade dispute have permanently redirected supply chains that used to function with little drama and almost automatic coordination. The consequences are not buried in economic reports that only analysts read. They are visible in the detailed cost sheets builders review before pouring foundations, in the higher monthly payments families calculate before signing mortgage documents, and in the rent hikes that landlords explain to tenants who are already stretched thin. A tariff designed to protect one slice of American industry has reshaped the entire North American lumber market, shifting leverage, altering trade routes, and redefining who controls supply. Canada reorganized, invested billions, and built a structure that reduces reliance on a single customer. The United States now confronts a housing challenge that looks more entrenched than ever, with fewer options to ease the pressure. So where does this go from here? Will Washington reconsider its approach before the housing shortage climbs even higher? Can American mills realistically scale fast enough to replace the missing Canadian volume? Or will elevated lumber prices become the new normal for a generation of homebuyers? And how will Canada's new export partnerships reshape global timber trade over the next decade? Drop thoughts in the comments, because this story is far from over and the policy choices made next could shape housing affordability for years to come. If this breakdown helped clarify what is happening behind the headlines, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so no major update gets missed. There is a lot more coming on trade policy, housing markets, and the economic shifts that quietly reshape everyday life, and staying informed matters now more than ever. See you in the next one.